A freezing morning, a homeless man and his dog were quietly pushed out of a store like they didn't belong in the world. No one spoke up until a former Navy SEAL stepped forward and refused to look away. What seemed like a small act of kindness soon uncovered something darker hidden beneath this quiet town. As the cold grew harsher, the man and his loyal dog were left with nowhere to go, except one unexpected place. Inside a lonely cabin, a broken soldier, a dying man, and a silent dog began to change each other in ways no one could explain. But what the old man did before he died would leave behind something far more powerful than words. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that stay with you. The morning arrived like a quiet promise no one had asked for. Snow lay thin and untouched across the rooftops of Frost Hollow, a small northern town where winter did not simply visit. It settled in like an old tenant who knew no one would dare ask it to leave. The light was bright, almost gentle, reflecting off the snow in a way that made the world look cleaner than it really was. Elias Thorne drove slowly down Main Street in his aging pickup truck, the engine humming with the same tired consistency as the man behind the wheel. He was 55, though the years had carved deeper into him than numbers could measure. At 1.85 meters, broad-shouldered and solidly built, he carried himself with the controlled stillness of someone who had spent most of his life conserving energy for the moment it mattered. His face was sharply defined, strong jaw, clean-shaven, the kind of masculine symmetry that once might have been called handsome without hesitation. Now it was simply weathered. His dark hair, cut in a neat undercut, had begun to silver at the edges. His eyes, blue-gray and steady, held something quieter than pain, but heavier than peace. He wore the same thing he always wore. A fitted long-sleeve camouflage shirt in muted green matched with equally practical tactical pants. The outfit sat close to his body, not for show, but for function. It was a uniform he had never truly taken off, even here, even now. Even when the war had ended years ago. Elias pulled into the gravel lot outside the only convenience store in town. The building was small but warm-looking, yellow light, glowing from behind fog-glass windows. It was the kind of place that sold everything from coffee to cheap batteries, and where conversations lingered longer than purchases. He stepped out of the truck, boots pressing into the thin snow with a quiet crunch, and paused for a moment. The cold bit into his lungs. It reminded him of something. It always did. But he pushed the thought aside and walked inside. The warmth hit him immediately, dry, artificial, and thick with the smell of coffee, fried food, and something faintly sweet. Inside, the store was alive with small, ordinary moments. A mother trying to keep her child from grabbing candy. A man in a heavy jacket tapping his foot impatiently near the register. A radio playing softly behind the counter, some forgotten country song about heartbreak and highways. Elias moved through it all without speaking, gathering what he needed with quiet efficiency. Coffee, bread, a small bag of dog food. He stopped when he realized what he was holding. Dog food. For a second, his hand tightened around the bag. He stared at it as if it had appeared there on its own. He hadn't owned a dog in 3 years, not since the accident. Still, he placed it in his basket. Old habits had a way of outliving everything else. That was when the door opened again. The cold came in first, then the man. Milo Wren stepped inside with the careful hesitation of someone who had already been told many times before that he did not belong. He was thin, painfully so. His shoulders curved inward, not from weakness alone, but from years of learning how to take up less space in a world that had no room for him. His coat, once brown, had faded into an uneven gray, worn thin at the elbows. Beneath it, a flannel shirt hung loosely over a frame that had forgotten what fullness felt like. His hair was white, sparse and unkempt, and a short, uneven beard clung to his jaw. But it was his eyes that stayed with you, pale blue, tired, but not empty. There was something still alive in them, something stubborn, something that refused to disappear. Beside him stood a German shepherd. The dog was large, though not heavy. Its coat was a striking mix of deep black along the back and warm golden brown across the chest and legs. The fur was rough in places, dulled by exposure, but beneath it was strength. Real strength. Its ears stood upright, its posture was alert but calm. Its eyes, amber, sharp, and deeply aware, moved across the room with quiet precision. This was not a stray. This was a dog that had chosen to survive. Its name, though no one in the store knew it yet, was Brim. The shift in the room was immediate. People didn't say anything at first. They didn't have to. They moved, a step back, a glance away, a tightening of shoulders. Discomfort spread quietly, like frost creeping across glass. Milo noticed. Of course he did. He always noticed. He kept his head down and moved slowly toward the shelves, one hand resting lightly against the dog's neck, as if reminding himself that he wasn't entirely alone. Elias watched from across the aisle. He didn't move. He just watched. Darren Pike emerged from behind the counter a moment later. He was in his mid-40s, his appearance carefully maintained. Dark hair neatly combed, shirt pressed, sleeves rolled just enough to suggest effort without losing control. His face carried a practiced expression, half polite, half distant, but his eyes betrayed something colder. Calculation. Judgment. He approached Milo with a thin smile that never reached his eyes. "Sir," Darren said, voice smooth but edged, "we don't allow animals in the store." Milo stopped. His hand tightened slightly on Brim's collar. "He won't cause trouble," Milo replied, voice quiet but steady. "He just stays with me." Darren's smile faded just enough to show the truth beneath it. "It's not about trouble," he said. "It's about standards." A few people in the store shifted uncomfortably. Milo nodded quickly. "Just a minute," he said. "I'll get what I need and be out." He moved to the shelf, picking up a loaf of bread, then a can of soup. Nothing more, nothing unnecessary. Everything he touched was chosen like it mattered. Because it did. Brim suddenly stopped moving, not sharply, not aggressively, just stopped. The dog's entire body stilled, as if something unseen had passed through the air. Its ears twitched once. Then it turned its head. Not toward Darren, not toward the door, but toward Elias. And it held that gaze. Longer than was normal, longer than made sense. Elias felt it before he understood it. A quiet pressure, a recognition, as if the dog wasn't just looking at him, but seeing through him, seeing something buried, something he had spent years trying to leave behind. For a brief, strange moment, the noise of the store faded, the radio, the voices, the footsteps, all of it slipped away. And there was only that gaze, steady, unwavering, waiting. The moment broke when Darren cleared his throat. "Let's move this along," he said, impatience creeping in. "You're holding up the line." Milo stepped forward to the register, placing his items down carefully. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a handful of coins. They clinked softly against the counter. Darren sighed, audibly. "Do you have anything larger than that?" he asked, already annoyed. Milo shook his head. "That's what I've got." Darren glanced at the people behind him, then back at Milo. "You might want to hurry." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The pressure was enough. Milo began counting, slowly, carefully, as if each coin carried weight, as if making a mistake would cost more than money. Behind him, someone muttered something about wasting time. Another shifted their cart loudly. No one stepped forward. No one said a word. Except one man, Elias Thorne. He moved without urgency, stepping into line beside Milo and placing his basket down. "Put it all together," he said. Darren looked up, surprised. "All?" he asked. Elias met his gaze. "His and mine." There was no aggression in his voice, no raised tone, just certainty. Darren hesitated. For a moment, something in his expression shifted, calculation meeting something it couldn't easily measure. Then he rang the items through. "Next time," Darren muttered under his breath, "make sure you can pay." Elias didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence he left behind said enough. Tessa Wynne stood behind the register, watching everything unfold. She was young, early 20s, with pale skin and tired eyes that hadn't yet learned how to hide discomfort. Her blonde hair was tied back loosely, a few strands falling across her face. She wore the store uniform, but it sat on her like something borrowed. She handed the receipt over with a small, uncertain nod. "Have a good day," she said, though the words felt out of place. Milo took the bag. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then, quietly, "Thank you." It wasn't loud, but it was real. They walked toward the door. Brim moved with him, silent, steady. At the threshold, just before stepping back into the cold, the dog stopped. Again, it turned, looked back, at Elias. One last time. And in that look, there was no confusion, no hesitation, only something that felt dangerously close to knowing. Elias stood still long after they left. The store returned to normal around him. Voices resumed. The radio played on. Darren moved behind the counter as if nothing had happened, but something had. Something small, something quiet, something that refused to settle. That evening Elias sat alone in his cabin. A cup of coffee cooled in his hands as he stared out the window. Snow had begun to fall again. He could see the road disappearing beneath it, could almost hear the silence pressing in. For a moment, just a moment, he saw headlights. A flash of metal, ice on asphalt, a hand reaching for his that never reached back. He closed his eyes, exhaled. It was just one time, he murmured to the empty room, just helping someone. Nothing more. Outside, the wind shifted, stronger now, colder. Somewhere far off, a storm was gathering. The storm did not arrive with drama. It crept in. By morning, Frost Hollow looked unchanged at first glance, rooftops still white, trees still standing in quiet lines, the lake still frozen like a pane of glass under the pale northern sun. But the air had shifted. It carried a sharper edge, a warning buried inside every breath. Elias Thorne noticed it the moment he stepped outside his cabin. He stood on the wooden porch, boots planted firmly, shoulders squared against the wind. The forest behind his home stretched endlessly, dark pines heavy with snow, their branches bending under a weight that seemed almost human. The sky was clear, too clear. That kind of clarity often meant something worse was coming. His breath came out in slow, measured clouds. 55 years of living had taught him to read silence, and this silence was not empty. It was waiting. By noon, the radio confirmed it. "A polar front moving faster than expected," the announcer said, voice steady but tight around the edges. "Temperatures dropping below -20 tonight. Wind chill significantly lower. Residents are advised to stay indoors and limit travel." Elias turned the dial off. He didn't need warnings. He needed supplies. The town was busier than usual when he drove in. People moved quickly, carts fuller, conversations shorter. There was a subtle tension beneath the surface. Nothing loud, nothing panicked, but enough to be felt. Elias parked near the post office this time, not the convenience store. He stepped out, scanning automatically. Doors, windows, faces. Old habits didn't leave. They simply quieted. That was when he saw him again. Milo? The old man stood near a lamppost at the edge of the sidewalk, just far enough from the main entrance to avoid being told to leave, but close enough to be seen. He held a small cardboard sign. "Hot food if you can spare." The words were written carefully, each letter steady, as if dignity could be preserved through neat handwriting. Milo's posture had changed since the day before. He leaned slightly to one side, using the lamppost for balance. His coat looked thinner today, as though the cold had eaten into it overnight. His face was paler, lips slightly cracked from the dry air. But it wasn't his body that drew Elias's attention. It was the way he stood, still, not begging, not pleading, just present, as if he had accepted whatever came next. Beside him, Brim stood in the same quiet vigilance. The dog's coat was dusted with snow, clinging to the dark ridge of his back and melting slowly along his sides. His ears were forward, alert, but not tense. His eyes moved constantly, reading people, measuring distance, sensing intention. But there was something different today. A subtle fatigue, not weakness, just wear. His breathing was deeper, slower. And when the wind cut harder across the street, Brim shifted just slightly, positioning his body between Milo and the gust, shielding him, not out of instinct alone, out of choice. Elias stood still longer than he should have. He could have walked past. He almost did. His boots carried him forward, one step, then another, as if the decision had already been made. But something pulled him back, not loudly, not urgently, just enough. He stopped, turned, watched. A woman exited the post office and passed Milo without looking at him. A man in a thick coat paused for half a second, then shook his head and kept moving. A young couple slowed, whispered something to each other, then crossed to the other side of the street. No one said anything cruel. That made it worse. Silence could cut deeper than words. Milo shifted his grip on the sign. His hand trembled slightly now. He tried to steady it. Brim noticed. The dog pressed closer, his shoulder brushing against the old man's leg. Milo's fingers dropped from the sign for just a second, just long enough to rest against the dog's neck. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that came from knowing you had one thing left in the world, and it was standing right beside you. Elias exhaled slowly. He knew that look, not the hunger, not the cold, the acceptance, the quiet understanding that help might not come, and that you would have to endure anyway. He had seen that look in men before, in places far colder than this, in situations far worse, and every time it had meant the same thing. You were close to losing them. He stepped forward. "Come on," Elias said, voice low, controlled. Milo looked up, confused. "Sir?" "You shouldn't be out here," Elias said. "Not today." Milo gave a small, tired smile. "I've been in worse," he replied. Elias didn't argue. Men like Milo didn't respond to arguments. They responded to facts. "You won't be," Elias said. "Not if you stay." They walked together toward the truck. Brim hesitated once, just a fraction, his eyes scanning Elias carefully, as if making a decision. Then he followed. The interior of the truck warmed slowly. Milo sat stiffly at first, hands folded in his lap, as though unsure what he was allowed to touch. Brim lay at his feet, alert, head resting just above his paws. Elias drove in silence. The road stretched ahead, white and narrow, disappearing into the trees. After a while, Milo spoke. "There's a shelter near the church," he said. "You can drop me there." Elias shook his head. "Too full," he replied, "and they won't take the dog inside overnight." Milo didn't answer immediately. He looked down at Brim. His hand moved, almost unconsciously, resting against the dog's neck again. "That's not an option," he said quietly. As the truck slowed at an intersection, Brim suddenly lifted his head, not toward the road, not toward a sound, but toward Elias. The dog stared at him through the rearview mirror, unblinking, focused. And for a brief, unsettling moment, Elias felt something shift deep inside his chest, as if the decision he was about to make was not entirely his own. The truck idled. Snow drifted lightly across the windshield. Elias tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Then he turned away from town. The cabin sat at the edge of the forest, half hidden by trees. It wasn't large, but it was solid, built to last, built to withstand winters that didn't forgive mistakes. Elias stepped out first, scanning the area out of habit before opening the passenger door. "Inside," he said. Milo hesitated. "You don't have to." "It's temporary," Elias cut in. That was all he offered. That was all he could offer. Inside, the warmth felt different than the store, less artificial, more earned. The fire crackled in the stove, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. The air smelled faintly of pine and old smoke. Milo stood near the door, unsure where to go. Brim stepped forward first, moving slowly, carefully, taking in the space. He circled once, then sat near the back entrance, positioned where he could see both inside and out. Guarding, always guarding. Elias set a bowl of water down, then another, then food. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't need to. The hours passed quietly. Milo spoke little. When he did, it was simple. Answers, not stories. Elias didn't push. Trust didn't come from questions. It came from time. Night fell hard. The temperature dropped fast. The wind rose. By midnight, the storm had arrived, not loudly, not violently, but completely. Elias woke to a sound, not a crash, not a voice, a small, steady tapping. He reached for the knife beside his bed, instinct, not fear, and moved toward the door. The cabin was dim. Firelight flickered low. The sound came again. Wood against wood, measured, deliberate. He found Milo near the back door. The old man was crouched slightly, hands working carefully at the latch, not breaking in, fixing it. The wood had warped slightly from the cold, leaving a small gap. Milo adjusted it with practiced hands, tightening, aligning, testing. It took him a few minutes. When he was done, he stood slowly, wincing just slightly as his back straightened. Elias watched, said nothing. "You had a draft," Milo said quietly. "Would have gotten worse." Elias nodded once. "Thanks." That was it. No praise, no suspicion, just acknowledgement. Behind them, Brim lay on the floor, watching both men. His eyes moved from Milo to Elias and back again, as if measuring something neither of them could see yet. Morning came slower. The storm had settled, leaving the world buried under fresh snow. Elias stepped outside first. The air was sharper now, cleaner, dangerous in a quieter way. When he returned inside, Milo was already awake, sitting at the small table, a loaf of bread in front of him, carefully sliced, piece by piece. He placed one portion in a bowl. For Brim, then another. For himself, smaller. Elias watched from the doorway. For a moment, something tightened in his chest. Not anger, not pity. Something else? Something older? He stepped forward, set a bowl of hot soup on the table, closer to Milo than to himself. The old man looked up, surprised. Then nodded once. Not as a thank you, but as an understanding. And just like that, without ceremony, without words, without promises, something had begun. The storm did not end. It settled. Days passed, and the cold no longer felt like an event. It became the background, a constant pressure against the walls of the cabin, against the glass, against the lungs of anyone who stepped outside for too long. Frost Hollow slowed down, roads emptied, conversations shortened. Even the wind seemed to move with purpose, as if it had decided to stay. Inside the cabin, something else began to shift, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily. Elias Thorne noticed it first in the silence. It was no longer the kind that pressed in from all sides. It no longer felt hollow. Now it had weight, but also presence. Milo Wren filled space without trying to. He didn't speak much, but he moved with a quiet rhythm. He made small repairs without asking. He wiped down surfaces as if it mattered. He stacked firewood unevenly at first, then corrected himself with the muscle memory of someone who had once done it every day. He wasn't trying to earn his place. He was simply living like he still deserved one. Brim adjusted faster. The German shepherd moved through the cabin as if mapping it into memory. Doorways, corners, the way the light shifted at different hours. His coat had begun to regain a faint sheen after a few days of warmth and food. The black along his back looked darker now, richer. The amber of his eyes seemed less guarded, though never careless. He had not chosen a place to sleep permanently. Not yet. Sometimes he lay near the back door, watching the forest. Sometimes near the stove, where warmth pooled low. And sometimes he lay between the two men. Milo sat at the small table one afternoon, turning a spoon slowly in his hand. The light from the window caught the lines on his face, deepening them. He looked older here, in warmth, than he had out in the cold. "You keep this place well," he said, glancing around. Elias leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "It holds," he replied. Milo gave a small smile. "That's more than most places can say." There was no pity in his voice, just observation. It was Mara Bell who knocked first. She came late in the afternoon, wrapped in a long olive coat that reached almost to her calves. Snow clung lightly to her boots as she stepped onto the porch. She was in her late 40s, slender but not fragile, her posture straight in the way of someone used to carrying quiet responsibility. Her hair, a soft chestnut brown, was pulled back loosely at the nape of her neck, and her eyes, warm, steady, took in more than she said. She carried a small crate of supplies, soup cans, bread, a thermos. "I figured you might have company," she said when Elias opened the door. Her voice was calm, but her eyes moved immediately past him, searching. They found Milo. For a moment something softened in her expression. "Milo," she said gently. Milo stood slowly. "Mara." No more needed to be said. Mara had known him before the streets had. She had seen the decline in stages. First the missed rent, then the smaller jobs, then the silence. She had tried to help where she could, food, blankets, small kindnesses left without attention. But her world had limits. A sick mother at home, a job that barely paid enough. Now, seeing him here, inside a warm cabin, she allowed herself a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "He's been all right?" she asked Elias quietly. Elias nodded once. "He's steady." Mara glanced at Brim. "And him?" Brim held her gaze for a moment, measured, then lowered his head slightly. Approval in its own way. They stayed only a short while. Mara didn't press. She never did. When she left, she placed a hand briefly on Milo's arm. "You don't disappear again?" she said softly. Milo nodded. "I'll try." That evening, the past began to surface, not all at once, not in a single story, but in fragments. "I used to build things," Milo said, staring into the fire. "Cabinets, frames, doors that didn't stick in winter." His voice held a faint trace of pride. "Had a place out past the ridge. Small, but it was mine." Elias listened without interrupting. "That was before my back gave out," Milo continued. "Before the hospital bills. Before everything started slipping." He paused. "Funny how it doesn't fall apart all at once. It goes piece by piece. Quiet enough that you think you can still fix it." Elias looked at the fire. He understood that. Better than he wanted to. "And the dog?" Elias asked after a moment. Milo smiled slightly. "Found him behind a scrapyard. Half-starved. Wouldn't come near me for 2 days." He glanced at Brim. "Third day, he sat about 10 feet away. Just watched. Same way he does now." Brim didn't react, but his ears shifted. Later that night, as the wind pressed harder against the cabin walls, Elias woke to a soft sound. Not movement, not a voice. Breathing. Uneven. He stepped into the hallway. Milo sat on the edge of the bed, hunched forward, one hand pressed against his chest. Brim stood in front of him, rigid, alert, not panicked, but focused in a way Elias had not seen before. The dog's eyes flicked toward Elias, then down, to the floor. A small cloth lay there, darkened. Elias stepped closer. Blood. Not much, but enough. Brim hadn't barked, hadn't made noise. He had simply waited, until someone who could understand finally saw. Milo wiped his mouth quickly. "It's nothing," he said. It wasn't. Elias didn't argue. He didn't confront. He just watched. And for the first time since Milo had arrived, the situation shifted, from temporary to something else. The next morning came heavy with quiet. Elias stood outside longer than usual. The sky was overcast now. The storm had settled deeper. Inside, Milo moved slower, carefully, as if trying not to reveal what his body was already saying. Brim stayed closer to him than before, not hovering, but never far. Elias made the decision before he spoke it. "We're going into town," he said. Milo looked up. "For what?" Elias met his gaze. "To get you checked." Milo hesitated. "No need. There is," Elias said. His tone left no room, not harsh, just final. Dr. Rowan Shaw's clinic sat near the edge of town, a modest building with faded siding and a small sign that had seen better years. Inside, it was warm, clean, quiet. Rowan Shaw himself stood behind the counter when they entered. He was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered but softened by time, his movements deliberate but unhurried. His hair was salt and pepper, cut short, and his face carried the kind of calm that came from years of seeing people at their worst and choosing not to turn away. His eyes moved first to Elias, then to Milo, then to Brim. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. "Come in," he said simply. The examination was thorough, quiet. Milo tried to downplay everything. Rowan didn't push. He didn't need to. He saw enough. Afterward, he stepped outside with Elias. The cold hit harder after the warmth. Rowan exhaled slowly. "How long has he been like this?" he asked. "Long enough," Elias replied. Rowan nodded. "Lungs are in bad shape. Years of exposure most likely. Heart's not holding up much better." He paused. "He's been running on willpower." Elias said nothing. Rowan looked at him directly. "That doesn't last forever." Inside, Milo sat quietly, Brim beside him. The dog's head rested lightly against his leg. Steady, present. Elias stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping back inside. The decision had already been made. He just hadn't said it out loud yet. And somewhere beneath the quiet of that small clinic, beneath the sound of wind and breath and time, something had shifted again. Not broken, not yet, but no longer holding the same way it had before. The cold did not leave. It settled deeper, pressing into the bones of Frost Hollow like a quiet verdict. Snowbanks hardened along the roads, wind carved thin lines across the surface, and the town slowed to a cautious rhythm. People stepping quicker, speaking less, keeping their heads down. Inside Elias Thorne's cabin, the fire burned steady. But something else had begun to burn as well. Elias stood by the window, looking out over the tree line. His reflection stared back at him faintly. Sharp features, silver threading through dark hair, eyes that had learned long ago how to observe without reacting. He had lived years mastering the art of distance. Distance from war, distance from grief, distance from anything that might ask him to care again. But distance had limits, and Milo Wren had reached one. The doctor's words from the day before lingered, not spoken loudly, not dramatic, just simple truth. The kind that didn't need emphasis. Elias had heard it before, in other forms, in other places. Men who kept going until they couldn't. Men who faded quietly because no one stepped in soon enough. Milo sat at the small table behind him, hands wrapped loosely around a cup of tea. He looked smaller now, not physically, though that too, but in the way his energy seemed to draw inward. His shoulders sloped more than before. His breath came slightly heavier when he thought no one was listening. Brim lay near his feet, head resting on his paws, but his eyes were open, watching, always watching. "I won't stay long," Milo said suddenly. Elias didn't turn. "Didn't ask you to," he replied. Milo gave a faint smile. "Still feels like I should say it." Elias nodded once. "Say what you need." Silence returned, but it was not the same silence as before. This one carried weight, decision. That afternoon, Elias drove back into town, not for supplies, for answers. Mara Bell was at the library when he found her. The building sat on the corner of a quiet street, its windows glowing warmly against the pale gray sky. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and old wood, the kind of place where time moved slower on purpose. Mara stood behind the front desk, organizing a stack of books. She looked up as Elias entered. Something in her expression changed, not surprise, but recognition. "You're not here for a book?" she said. Elias shook his head. "I need to ask you about something." Mara set the books down. Her posture straightened slightly. "About Milo." It wasn't a question. Mara moved around the desk and led him toward a quieter corner of the room. Up close, the details of her face became clearer. Fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the kind that came from years of both smiling and worrying. Her skin was pale but healthy, her voice always measured, never rushed. She had spent years in this town, watching people, listening, remembering. "He wasn't always like this," she said quietly. Elias leaned against a shelf. "Tell me." Mara folded her arms. "Darren started it slowly," she said. "At first it was small things, asking Milo to step outside, saying customers complained. Then it became rules." "What kind of rules?" "The kind that don't exist unless you're the one being pushed out." She met his gaze. "No dogs inside, no cash under a certain amount, no loitering, no unpleasant presence." Elias's jaw tightened slightly. "And people went along with it?" Mara didn't answer right away. "That's how it works here," she said finally. "No one wants trouble, so they look away." Elias nodded once. He understood that too well. He found Deputy Lena Hart outside the sheriff's office. She stood near her patrol car, clipboard in hand, speaking briefly with a man before dismissing him. She turned as Elias approached. Lena was tall, her posture straight, her movements efficient. Her blonde hair was tied back in a tight ponytail, strands escaping slightly in the wind. Her face was sharp, not harsh, but defined, and her eyes carried the steady alertness of someone who had learned to trust facts more than feelings. "Thorne," she said, "didn't expect to see you here." "I need to talk." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Walk with me." They moved down the street together, boots crunching over packed snow. "What's this about?" she asked. "Milo Wren." Lena exhaled quietly. "That's what I figured." Elias glanced at her. "You know what's been happening." "I've heard things," she said. "Rumors, complaints that never become statements." "Why?" "Because people don't want to sign their names to it." She stopped walking. "And because what Darren does sits in a gray area. It's not always illegal." Elias faced her. "Pushing someone into freezing conditions?" Lena held his gaze. "Proving that's intentional is harder than you think." Elias nodded slowly. He wasn't frustrated. He was calculating. As they stood there, a sudden bark cut through the cold air. Not loud, not frantic, sharp, precise. Elias turned instinctively. Across the street, Brim stood at the edge of the sidewalk, alone. No Milo, no leash, just the dog, still focused, eyes locked on something out of sight. Then Brim stepped forward, one slow step, then another, and stopped, as if marking a boundary, as if warning something unseen not to cross it. Elias felt a familiar shift in his chest, the kind that came before things changed. "Your dog?" Lena asked. "He's not mine," Elias replied, but he was already moving. Brim didn't move when Elias approached. He only glanced up briefly, acknowledging, then returned his attention to the alley beside the convenience store. The space was narrow, partially shadowed, snow-disturbed near the entrance. Elias crouched slightly, studying the ground. Footprints, multiple. Recent. He straightened. Lena watched him carefully. "What are you seeing?" "Pattern," Elias said. "Of what?" "Pressure." That evening, Elias found Tessa Wynne behind the counter again. The store was quieter now. Darren was nowhere in sight. Tessa looked up as he entered, her shoulders tensed, not out of fear, out of uncertainty. "I need to ask you something," Elias said. She hesitated, then nodded. "Quickly?" Up close, her youth showed more clearly, faint shadows under her eyes, hands that moved too fast when nervous. She was not built for confrontation, but she was not blind either. "He records people," she said before Elias could ask. Elias paused. "What?" Tessa swallowed. "Darren. He keeps his phone on him. Records when people come in, especially ones he doesn't like." "For what?" She shook her head. "I don't know. To laugh later, to show people. I've seen him do it." Elias's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "He's done it to Milo," she added quietly. Later that night, Elias stood outside the store, watching. The lights inside flickered slightly as Darren moved around. From this distance, Elias could see him clearly for what he was, not just a man running a business, a man controlling a space, deciding who belonged, who didn't. Elias didn't step inside. Not yet. He turned and walked back to the truck. By the time he reached the cabin, the sky had darkened completely. The air had grown even colder. Brim stood waiting on the porch, still, alert. Inside, Milo sat by the fire, hands resting loosely in his lap. He looked up as Elias entered. "Everything all right?" he asked. Elias paused, then nodded. "For now." A knock came at the door. Unexpected. Measured. Elias moved to it slowly, opened it. Darren Pike stood on the porch. His coat was buttoned neatly, hair untouched by the wind. His expression carried that same controlled politeness, tight, careful, almost practiced. "Evening," he said. Elias didn't respond. Darren's eyes shifted briefly past him, to Milo, then to Brim. "I heard you've taken in a guest," Darren continued. His voice was calm. Too calm. Elias stepped forward slightly, blocking the doorway. "Say what you came to say." Darren's smile thinned. "Just offering some advice," he said. "This town works best when people don't bring unnecessary complications into it." Elias didn't blink. "Define complications." Darren's gaze flicked toward Milo again. "You know exactly what I mean." Behind Elias, Brim moved, one step forward, silent, measured, his body aligned with the doorway, not aggressive, but unmistakably present. Darren noticed. Of course he did. For a brief moment, just a flicker, his confidence shifted. Not fear, awareness. He took a small step back, barely noticeable, but real. "Just be careful," Darren said, voice quieter now. "Some things don't belong here." Elias stepped closer. "Neither do you," he said. The wind picked up. Snow shifted across the porch. For a moment, no one moved. Then Darren turned, walked away, without another word. Elias closed the door, locked it. Inside, the fire crackled softly. Milo said nothing, but his eyes had changed. Less uncertainty, more understanding. Brim returned to his place by the door, lying down, watching. And Elias Thorne stood in the quiet of his cabin, knowing that this was no longer just about shelter. The storm had begun to loosen its grip, not fully, not kindly, but enough for people to step outside again, to reopen doors, to pretend normal life could return simply because the sky had lightened and the wind had softened. Frost Hollow breathed again, but the breath was shallow, and beneath it something unsettled moved quietly through the town. Elias Thorne noticed it the moment he drove past Main Street. People looked at him differently now, not openly, not directly, but in glances that lingered just a second too long. A man pumping gas paused mid-motion, eyes narrowing slightly. Two women outside the bakery leaned closer together when Elias passed, their conversation dropping to a whisper. A teenager sitting on the hood of a car stared openly before being nudged by his friend. It wasn't hostility. Not yet. But it wasn't acceptance either. It was something else. Doubt. Inside the truck, Milo sat quietly, hands folded in his lap. He had insisted on coming along. "I need to move a little," he had said earlier that morning, voice thin but stubborn. Elias hadn't argued, but he had noticed the way Milo's breathing had worsened overnight, and the way Brim refused to leave his side. Brim lay across the back seat now, head lifted slightly, eyes tracking every movement outside. His coat looked fuller than it had days ago, the black along his spine, sharp against the golden-brown fur beneath. But there was tension in him, coiled, controlled. He knew something had changed. Dogs always did. "They're talking," Milo said quietly. Elias didn't respond. "They always do," Milo added, a faint smile touching his lips. "Only difference is, now it's about you." Elias tightened his grip on the wheel. "I've heard worse." Milo nodded. "I'm sure you have." The pharmacy sat 2 blocks past the convenience store. Small, clean, quiet. Dr. Rowan Shaw had called ahead, making sure Milo's prescription would be ready. Inside, the warmth felt almost fragile. Temporary. The pharmacist, a woman in her mid-40s named Claire Henson, stood behind the counter. She was of average height, with a narrow frame and sharp features softened by tired kindness. Her dark hair was pulled into a loose bun, and faint lines around her eyes suggested years spent balancing empathy with efficiency. She glanced up as Elias and Milo entered. Recognition flickered. Then something else. Concern. "Mr. Wren," she said gently. "I've got everything ready." Milo nodded, stepping forward carefully. "Thank you." Claire's eyes moved briefly to Elias, then to Brim. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. That alone made her different. As she prepared the medication, the door behind them opened. The air shifted. Not colder, sharper. Darren Pike stepped inside. He carried himself differently now, not the polished, controlled version from before. Something underneath had cracked. His coat was still neat, his posture still straight, but his expression had hardened, the edges sharper, less contained. His eyes moved across the room, locked onto Elias, then Milo, then Brim. "Well," Darren said, voice loud enough to carry, "this is becoming a pattern." No one spoke. Claire froze slightly behind the counter. Elias turned slowly. "What do you want?" Darren smiled, but it wasn't polite. "Just checking in," he said, "making sure our town hasn't become something else." Milo lowered his gaze. His shoulders tightened. Elias noticed. That was enough. "You've said enough," Elias replied. Darren stepped closer. "I don't think I have." His eyes flicked toward Milo. "You know, people have been asking questions, wondering why someone like him is being protected." Milo flinched, barely visible, but real. "Careful," Elias said quietly. Darren's smile widened. "Careful of what?" Brim rose, not abruptly, not violently, but with purpose. The dog stepped forward once, placing himself just slightly ahead of Milo, not touching, not blocking, but present in a way that altered the space. His head lowered, ears forward, eyes locked. No growl, no bark, just stillness. And in that stillness, there was something far more dangerous than noise. For a brief second, Darren's voice caught, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for Elias to see. Darren recovered quickly, cleared his throat. "Keep your animal under control," he muttered. "He is," Elias replied. The tension broke when the door opened again. Deputy Lena Hart stepped inside. She moved with purpose. No hesitation. Her uniform was crisp despite the weather, her coat dusted lightly with snow. Her eyes swept the room once, taking in the positions, the distance, the posture of each person. She didn't ask what was happening. She already knew. "Darren," she said evenly. Darren turned, relaxed slightly. "Deputy?" "Step back." Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Darren exhaled slowly. "I'm just talking." "No," Lena replied. "You're not." Claire set the medication on the counter, her hand steadier now. Milo reached for it carefully. His fingers trembled. Elias stepped closer, not to Darren, to Milo, positioning himself without making it obvious. From the back of the store, another figure appeared. Tessa Wynne. She looked different today, not smaller, not weaker, just decided. Her posture was still hesitant, her hands still uncertain, but her eyes held something new. Resolve. She stepped forward slowly. "Deputy," she said. Lena turned. "Yes?" Tessa swallowed, then spoke. "He's done this before." Silence filled the room. Darren's head snapped toward her. "Tessa." "No," she said quickly. "You told me to ignore it, to not get involved." Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. "You record people. You make them stand outside. You told him to leave when it was freezing." She gestured toward Milo. Darren laughed. Sharp, dismissive. "Is this what this is now?" he said. "Stories?" Lena didn't look at him. She looked at Tessa. "Are you willing to put that in a statement?" Tessa hesitated for just a second, then nodded. "Yes?" The room shifted, not dramatically, but enough. Darren saw it. Of course he did. He stepped back, slowly. His expression hardened again. "You're making a mistake," he said, though it sounded less certain now. "No," Lena replied. "You already did." Outside, a few people had begun to gather, not close, not involved, but watching. Milo stood still, the medication in his hand. His breathing had grown uneven, not from illness alone, from the weight of being seen. Elias placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. "Let's go." Milo nodded. They stepped outside together. The cold air hit harder than before, but it felt different now, less empty. Behind them, voices rose inside the store, muted, distant, uncertain. In the truck, Milo sat without speaking. Brim lay beside him, closer than before, his head resting lightly against Milo's leg. After a long moment, Milo spoke. "I didn't want it to be like that." Elias kept his eyes on the road. "I know. I wasn't trying to cause trouble." "You didn't," Milo nodded slowly. His hand moved, resting on Brim's neck. The dog didn't shift, didn't move, just stayed. That night, the cabin felt different again, quieter, but not in the same way as before. Milo sat near the fire, his fingers moving slowly through Brim's fur. The flames reflected in his eyes, soft, fading. "You know," he said after a while, "I got used to being invisible." Elias didn't respond. Easier that way, Milo continued. No expectations, no disappointment. He paused, then looked up. But today, his voice caught, just slightly. I felt human again. The words hung in the air, simple, unadorned, heavy. Elias looked at him, really looked, and for a moment something inside him shifted. Not broken, not healed, but moving. Outside, the snow fell lighter now, slower, as if the storm itself had begun to tire. Inside, two men sat in silence, a dog between them, and for the first time in a long while, the cold didn't feel like the only thing left. The town did not celebrate, not openly, not loudly, but something had shifted in Frost Hollow. Darren Pike was no longer behind the counter. The store still opened, still sold its bread and coffee, but the man who had once stood there with quiet authority was gone, suspended, investigated, spoken about in tones that had changed from agreement to discomfort. People no longer looked away as easily. That was the real difference. Elias Thorne noticed it in small ways. A nod from the man at the gas station. A hesitant greeting from a woman who had once crossed the street to avoid Milo. A thermos left on the porch one morning. No name, still warm. The town had not become kinder overnight, but it had begun to remember how. Inside the cabin, time moved differently. Slower, closer, more fragile. Milo Wren sat by the window most mornings now. The chair had become his place, not by decision, but by necessity. He leaned back carefully, his breathing shallow but steady enough to hold. The light touched his face gently, softening the deep lines, turning the years into something quieter. He looked smaller each day, not diminished, just nearing something. Brim stayed close, always. The German shepherd no longer roamed the cabin as he had in the early days. Now he chose his positions with purpose, near Milo's feet, beside his chair, sometimes resting his head against the old man's knee as if listening to something deeper than breath. His coat had regained its strength fully now, thick and rich, the black and gold clean again. But his eyes had changed. There was no confusion in them any more, only understanding. Dr. Rowan Shaw came by twice that week. He never stayed long, never said more than necessary. But Elias saw it in his face, the quiet acceptance of what could not be reversed. "The body remembers everything," Rowan said once, standing near the doorway, his voice low. "It keeps going as long as it can, but there's a limit to what it can forgive." Elias didn't respond. He didn't need to. Milo seemed to know. Of course he did. Men like him always did. And yet, he smiled more. "You know," Milo said one afternoon, watching the snow fall softly beyond the glass, "this is the first time in years I've felt warm." Elias stood near the stove, adding another piece of wood. "You are warm," he said. Milo shook his head gently. "No," he replied. "I mean, inside." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full. Milo began telling stories, not the kind that carried regret, the kind that held laughter. "There was this one night," he said, a faint grin forming. "Some drunk fool thought he'd kick Brim away from my bedroll." Brim's ears twitched slightly at the sound of his name. "He didn't bark," Milo continued. "Didn't growl, just took the man's glove clean off his hand and walked away with it." Elias raised an eyebrow. "What happened to the glove?" Milo chuckled softly. "Never saw it again." Brim shifted slightly, as if the memory had weight. That evening, Elias returned from splitting wood to find Milo sitting on the porch. The storm had eased, leaving behind a pale, almost gentle light that stretched across the frozen ground. Milo sat wrapped in a blanket, shoulders slightly hunched, his breath faint in the cold air. Brim lay with his head resting across Milo's knees, perfectly still. Elias stopped at the edge of the porch. Something about the scene held him. Not the stillness, not the quiet, something deeper. Milo looked up. His eyes found Elias easily, and for a moment, there was something in that gaze Elias had not seen before. Not pain, not fear. Something settled. "He's been watching you," Milo said softly, his hand resting against Brim's neck. Elias frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Milo smiled. "Not like a dog watches a stranger," he said. like he watches a man he's already chosen. Elias shook his head. "He's yours." Milo's smile didn't fade. "No," he said quietly. "He never was." The wind moved gently through the trees. Brim didn't lift his head, but his eyes opened, and for just a second, they met Elias's. That night came colder, not from the weather, from something else. Milo's breathing worsened after midnight. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't dramatic, just heavier. Each inhale took longer, each exhale carried more effort. Elias sat beside him, not speaking, just there. Brim lay on the floor next to the bed, closer than ever, his body pressed lightly against the frame, as if trying to anchor something that was already drifting. Milo opened his eyes slowly. "Don't make it complicated," he said. Elias leaned forward slightly. "I'm not?" Milo smiled faintly. "You will," he murmured. "That's what men like you do." Elias didn't answer. Milo lifted his hand, slowly, deliberately. He placed it on Brim's neck first, fingers threading through the thick fur. Then, with effort, he reached for Elias's wrist. The contact was light, but steady. "I'm not giving him to you," Milo said softly. Elias's jaw tightened. "Milo!" "Listen," Milo whispered. His grip was weaker now, but it held. "He doesn't belong to anyone," Milo continued. "You understand that better than most." Elias said nothing. "But he stays where he's needed," Milo said. His eyes moved between them. "Right now, that's you." Elias shook his head. "He needs you." Milo's smile returned, faint, tired, but certain. "No," he said. "I've already had my time." The room fell silent again, only the sound of breathing, of fire, of something ending without needing to announce it. Milo closed his eyes, still holding both of them. Elias didn't move, didn't pull away. Brim shifted slightly. His head rose, his body tensed, not in fear, in awareness. And then, just like that, it happened. No struggle, no sudden change, just a quiet stillness that settled deeper than sleep. Elias sat there, hand still held. Brim leaned forward slowly, rested his head against Milo's chest, waited. The fire crackled softly behind them. Outside, snow began to fall again, light, gentle, as if the world itself had chosen to lower its voice. Morning came quietly. Mara Bell stood on the porch first, her coat pulled tight around her, her breath steady despite the cold. She didn't knock. She didn't need to. Deputy Lena arrived shortly after, then Rowan, and a few others. Not many, but enough. No one spoke loudly. No one tried to explain. The small service took place near the edge of the woods. Simple, honest. Milo Wren was not buried as a forgotten man, not this time. Brim stood beside Elias the entire time, still, silent. He did not howl, did not bark, but he did not look away either. That night, the cabin felt larger and emptier. Elias sat on the porch long after dark. The cold pressed in again, but he didn't move. Brim lay near the door, not inside, not outside, somewhere in between. Hours passed. Finally, the dog rose, walked over, slowly, and rested his head against Elias's knee. Elias didn't react at first. Then, his hand moved, almost without thought, resting against Brim's neck. And for the first time in years, Elias Thorne did not hold it back. He bowed his head, closed his eyes, and let the silence break. Winter did not end in a single moment. It loosened its grip, finger by finger, breath by breath, until one morning the air no longer cut like glass when drawn into the lungs. The sun lingered longer over Frost Hollow now, not warm, not yet, but brighter, enough to remind the town that cold was not the only thing it could hold. Elias Thorne noticed the change in the light before he noticed it in himself. It came through the cabin windows differently, spilling across the wooden floor, touching the edges of the table where Milo used to sit, lingering on the chair that now stood empty, but no longer felt abandoned. There were still silences in the cabin, but they were no longer hollow. They carried memory, and something quieter, something that felt like continuation. Brim adjusted first. The German shepherd had settled into a rhythm that did not need explanation. He woke early, often before Elias, padding quietly across the cabin floor before taking his place near the front door. Not guarding, not waiting. just present. His coat had thickened fully again, the black along his back glossy under the lengthening daylight, the gold beneath it catching the light like something alive. His body moved with strength now, clean, measured, controlled. But it was his eyes that held the most change. They were no longer searching. They were choosing. Elias watched him from across the room one morning, a mug of coffee warming his hands. "You've decided, haven't you?" he said quietly. Brim didn't move, but one ear shifted. That was answer enough. The town changed more slowly. It always did. Darren Pike was no longer part of it in the same way. He hadn't disappeared. Men like him rarely did. But the space he occupied had shrunk. The authority he once carried, quiet, controlled, unquestioned, had fractured. He was seen now, and being seen had cost him more than any formal consequence ever could. The store had new management, a temporary replacement who kept his head down and his voice low, a man in his late 30s named Caleb Turner, broad-shouldered, soft-spoken, with a beard that looked more practical than styled, and eyes that avoided conflict rather than invited it. He treated customers the same, no matter how they looked. It wasn't kindness, not exactly, but it was a start. Tessa Wynne no longer worked there. Elias saw her once outside the library, bundled in a thick coat, her posture still cautious but steadier now. She had found work at a small diner on the edge of town, long hours, modest pay, but no one watching her hands, no one measuring her silence. She nodded when she saw Elias. A quiet acknowledgement, a shared understanding. Maribel had done what she always did. She gathered the pieces others left behind. With the help of the church, she organized a small outreach. Nothing grand, nothing formal. Just warm meals during the coldest nights, blankets stacked neatly in the corner of the hall, names remembered where they had once been forgotten. She never called it a program. She called it keeping the door open. Deputy Lena Hart didn't speak about the case much, but her work shifted. Reports that once sat untouched were now followed through. Complaints that might have been dismissed were now documented, revisited, questioned. Not everything changed, but enough did, enough to matter. Elias did not return to the town for praise. He never would. He kept Milo's things where they had last been, not arranged, not preserved. Just there. A small carving knife with a worn handle sat on the shelf near the window. A chipped ceramic cup rested beside the sink. A piece of unfinished wood, its edges rough, its shape uncertain, remained on the table where Milo had left it. Elias didn't move them. He didn't need to. They were not reminders of loss. They were evidence of presence. Brim moved through those spaces carefully. He would pause near the chair sometimes, lowering his head slightly as if listening. Then he would move on, not lingering long enough to make it into something else. He understood something Elias was still learning. That absence did not require abandonment. They began to walk together, not out of necessity, out of habit. The trails behind the cabin stretched deeper into the forest, winding between tall pines and open patches where the snow had begun to soften. The air carried a faint scent of thaw beneath the cold, a quiet promise buried under layers of winter. Elias walked ahead most days. Brim stayed just behind him, close, but not dependent. One afternoon, they reached the edge of the frozen lake. The surface had begun to shift, small cracks spreading outward like veins beneath the ice, sunlight reflecting off them in fractured patterns. Elias stopped. Brim stepped beside him. They stood there for a long moment, looking out across something that had once been solid and was now changing. "You don't replace what's gone," Elias said quietly. Brim didn't move. "You carry it." A pause. "And you keep moving anyway." A sound carried across the lake, faint, uncertain. Brim's head lifted immediately, his body stilled, not tense, not alarmed, focused. Elias turned, following the direction of the dog's gaze. Near the far edge of the shoreline, a figure stood. Small, still. An old man. Not Milo? Different? But similar. He held something in his hands. Coins, counting them slowly, carefully. Brim stepped forward. One step, then stopped. He didn't bark, didn't run, just waited. And in that stillness, Elias felt it again. Not memory, not grief, something else, something returning. They left the lake without speaking, but neither of them forgot what they had seen. The town felt different when they entered it that afternoon. Not warmer, not softer, just aware. They passed the old convenience store. Brim slowed, as he always did. He stopped just outside the entrance, stood still for a few seconds, then moved on. Elias didn't rush him. He never did. 2 blocks later, they reached a smaller shop, a modest place with worn wooden steps and a faded sign above the door. Outside, near the entrance, an elderly man stood, thin, shoulders slightly bent, holding a few coins in his hand, looking at the door as if unsure whether he should go in. Elias slowed, stopped. He didn't need to ask, didn't need to think. He looked down at Brim. The dog was already looking up at him. No hesitation, no confusion, just recognition. Elias exhaled slowly, a breath that carried more than air. "All right," he said. And together. They stepped forward. No speech, no explanation, no hesitation, just 2 figures moving through the cold, towards something small, something ordinary, something that mattered. Back at the cabin, the fire burned steadily. The light stretched across the floor again. The chair by the window remained empty, but not alone. Brim lay near the door. Elias sat at the table, the carving knife still where it had been, the unfinished wood still waiting. For the first time in years, Elias picked it up, turned it in his hand, considered its shape, not as something to finish, but as something to continue. Outside, the snow melted slowly. Water traced quiet paths beneath the surface. The world did not change all at once, but it changed. And inside that small cabin at the edge of the forest, a man who had once believed he had nothing left to give sat beside a dog who had chosen him, and found, quietly, that he was still capable of carrying light. This story reminds us that not every miracle arrives with thunder. Sometimes God sends grace in quiet forms, a warm room on a freezing night, a stranger who chooses not to look away, an old man who leaves behind love instead of bitterness, and a loyal dog who seems to understand the human heart better than words ever could. The lesson is simple, but it is not small. A person can lose money, health, home, and even dignity in the eyes of the world, and still remain worthy of love, kindness, and respect. And sometimes the people who seem most broken are the very ones God uses to heal someone else. Milo did not stay in Elias's life forever, but he left behind something greater than his own suffering. He left a living reminder that love is still possible after grief, that compassion can wake up a soul that has gone cold, and that one act of mercy can begin changing more than one life. In everyday life, many of us pass people who are hurting in ways we cannot see. Some are lonely, some are ashamed, some are carrying losses they never speak about. We may not be able to solve every pain, but we can offer a kind word, a helping hand, a little patience, a little dignity. And sometimes that small choice becomes the very place where God begins His work. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. I would love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment when kindness felt like a miracle from God? And if you believe in stories about compassion, second chances, and healing, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more. May God bless every person watching this. May He protect your path, heal what is heavy in your heart, bring peace to your home, and send light into every dark place of your life. Amen.